Now I want to turn to another story, one that you alluded to, Rania, and that is the ongoing crackdown against, well, seemingly everything when you look at what they're saying right here. And that is people are calling it the Trump crackdown on dissent, different things like that, but it all flowing from this National Security Directive NSPM-7, which directs all 200 Joint Terrorism Task Force and basically the entirety of the federal law enforcement apparatus to target groups for everything, for being anti-Christian, anti-American, extreme on race, all sorts of different pieces to it. I think it's very alarming to many people, and we are very, very honored to have with us on the show the investigative journalist who has been on the trail like none other in unveiling what's really happening with NSPM-7, and that is Ken Klippenstein. Ken, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Hey guys, good to be here.
Well, great to have you with us. And even though I'd like to assume that every single person is reading your stuff every day as they should be, maybe you could start by just explaining what is this NSPM-7? What does it actually do? And if you could speak specifically to something that you pointed out that I thought is very important, is how there's kind of a pre-crime element to it as well.
So I would say in a nutshell, NSPM-7, National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, directs the entirety of federal law enforcement to prioritize domestic terrorism as defined by those indicators that you were describing before: anti-Christian sentiment, anti-government, anti-traditional family. I mean, some of these, I don't even know how you would define them. I mean, that could be like a bachelor, right?
Right.
So I don't know if the Trump base realizes that, but the question is, how can that be applied? And basically what it does is it allows the investigation to predicate or open investigations just using those super broad, what they consider to be indicators of future terrorist acts. That basically means that anyone who isn't MAGA can have an investigative predicated. And a lot of the coverage on this has been so sloppy. If you look at the mainstream press, they've said things like, oh, you can't actually designate, Antifa a domestic terrorist organization. There's no such statute. That's narrowly true. There is no law for a domestic terrorist designation, but that doesn't mean the FBI can't investigate them. It doesn't mean they can't go through your information. It doesn't mean they can't audit your taxes. They can't do all kinds of invasive things that are going to have, and we've seen to have a chilling effect on free speech and protest. But I would say in a nutshell, that is what it is. It's kind of an open season for the national security state to go after their idea of, I call it the born and bred scare. Instead of the Red Scare. Like they're worried now that the war on terror has come home. It's no longer focused on Al-Qaeda and ISIS and these groups overseas. That mission has been drawn down, at least officially. Not to say we're not still doing things to those groups, but now the articulation has been the enemy within, and we're going to come back and worry about these quote unquote extremists at home.
Well, it's really frightening, the kind of rhetoric, the enemy within. I mean, all of these things sort of give you this is like what fascists say. Are we allowed to say that though? We're not saying anyone's fascist because we're not terrorists here, because apparently it's now a terrorist act or sort of pre-crime.
You got to be NSPM-7 compliant. You got to make sure that.
Yeah, and we are NSPM-7 compliant on Breakthrough News. Thank you very much. You can cut that and put it on Twitter. But no, in all seriousness, Ken, I mean, it's pretty incredible because you broke this story. And it's really alarming, right? Because this isn't even just going after like leftists. That would be alarming enough. But it seems to kind of just be going after anyone who's just critical for the Trump administration, which you've pointed out. And as you also pointed out, and I think some media outlets almost were forced to cover it because you kept hammering them on it, but there has been an almost media blackout on this story. I mean, if you go look up NSPM-7 in Google News, you'll get a couple articles here and there, but there's not really much on it. Major outlets that are, normally quick to criticize Trump have barely touched it. So I'm just curious, why do you think the corporate press is so quiet on NSPM-7, and why are they downplaying something that's this serious? There was even one case, I think you might have posted it or retweeted it, on someone on MSNBC literally downplaying it to the point of saying this isn't serious. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, there's someone who's primarying Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker Emerita of the House, and he raised this issue and had, basically a sensible take on it. And this was during sort of like a roundtable debate thing where he's supposed to be discussing with other people. And the host just burst out laughing at the end of the question. She says, all right, we're going to go to break. And then they just cut the segment. So I think on some level, I think there are a few different things happening here. One is that it just sounds so crazy on its face that, in my newsletter, I've tried very hard to focus on what is Trump doing, not what Trump could do or what he said. What is the administration actually doing? Because there is, I think Trump derangement syndrome, there's something there. There are people that say things are going to happen that don't happen. And Trump himself says things are going to happen that don't. He's a bit of a troll. So I think there's on some level kind of like, it just sounds so ridiculous. But everything we've been talking about here is quoted directly from the memorandum, which is public. You can go on the White House page or on my newsletter and see the document itself. Those phrases, anti-Christianity, anti-government, that's directly from the document. So it's kind of a difficult situation where whenever I talk about it, particularly on more like centrist media, I realize I'm like, okay, how do I not sound like Alex Jones while I talk about this thing that so I try to stress, it's like, okay, this is a quote, this is not my paraphrase or whatever. So there's that. And then in addition, national security is just very complicated. And that is how they conceal so much of what they're doing, which is not just the inherent secrecy, but the bureaucratic culture of like even just the name. It puts people to sleep. National security, I say NSPM-7 because that's what it is. But whenever I say it, everybody's like, what is that? And it's like, it's not it's not an executive order. And you can find a number of different major media outlets like C-SPAN, for instance, that incorrectly and still haven't fixed it, described it as an executive order. And when you do that, people just kind of check out because there's been over 200 executive orders, many of them symbolic and not carrying much weight. What they don't understand is that a presidential directive, that carries a lot of weight. That is a high-level strategic document that directs the entirety of the federal government to focus on whatever the articulated priority is. And historically, when they've had presidential memoranda in the past, it's called NSPM-7 because there's only been 7 of them. 6 is classified. We don't even know what 6 is. In the past, they're often classified. To give you a historical example, President Carter issued one on that had the U.S. take a more aggressive stance in regards to nuclear posture against the then USSR. This led to huge backlash, protests, opposition, as it should have, in my view, and it should today. But for whatever reason, since the media can't explain how serious a presidential memorandum is, as opposed to these executive orders, and because some of the details are not easy to understand, I think they've sort of dropped the ball.
One thing I'm curious about is I mean, I've seen a couple people. I saw Ro Khanna react to some of your reporting. What are we seeing in terms of pushback in Congress? And given that it's an executive order action, what is their role? And I'm also curious, just from the sources you're talking to, what's the mood about this inside of the agencies themselves amongst the people who have to carry it out?
Well, that's one of the most striking aspects, was realizing in the national security state that people have the same concerns that you and I are talking about here. And these are not leftists. These are not protesters. These are people who are willing to work for the Department of Homeland Security or FBI or Justice Department, but who have some integrity. And there are people like that in government. I talk to them all the time. And they see this as not just, politically fraught, but potentially legally fraught too. And so, they're uneasy with this. I just reported today a ring camera footage of 2 FBI agents coming and interviewing someone who was not charged with a crime, who went to a anti-IS protest in Tucson, Arizona, and they look kind of nervous and uneasy, sort of uncharacteristic for FBI agents. They were both older, so they must have been experienced. I think that belies on their part some sense that they know they shouldn't be doing this stuff and that they're either embarrassed by it or nervous about backlash. And that's how I would characterize at least the people that talk to me, is having a lot of the same sorts of concerns that you would hear from groups like the ACLU, because they, in their careers, they're, like I said before, focused on ISIS, focused on Al-Qaeda. And now they're like, wait, these are just American kids protesting, or what, like, why are we doing this? So that's something that's really alarming. If anything, I've heard more concern from people within the national security apparatus than Congress. On the part of Congress, there's only been several. Ro Khanna came up with a fantastic statement. He likened it to, I think, a bigger attack on civil liberties than the Patriot Act, if I remember correctly. But other than that, I mean, there have been a couple of progressive members like Mark Pocan of Wisconsin, which is where I live, and here in Wisconsin, or he's actually my rep, or Pramila Jayapal. They and several other progressive members circulated some language warning about it. But even just reading the statement, I appreciate that they did it, but they don't seem to understand the implications here. Again, not easy to understand necessarily, but this should be the job of the media, which is go and report out what this means and how it's being implemented. As I understand it, they're expanding the terrorist watch list as a result of this, which should alarm everyone, and specifically the domestic terrorist watch list. Just a few months ago, they changed the name. FBI Director Kash Patel changed the name of the FBI to what's from the FBI's terror watch list, which was called the terrorist watch list. Now it's the threat now it's the Threat Screening Center. And that gives you a sense of how much they're broadening their remit and how they define what it is they're going after. It's not just terrorism anymore. It is national security threats, as the press release around that demonstrates. So they're expanding the watch list. And all we've seen, one other person was Senator Alyssa Slotkin. To her credit, she's brought this up several times. But other than those names that I just mentioned, there has been hardly any discussion of any of this. In fact, someone from Courthouse News, God bless him, just ran up to them physically and said, "Hey, what do you think of NSPM-7?" The leadership, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, who's supposed to oversee the FBI, Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, he replies, "Oh, I don't know what that is. Sounds bad." And that was the same answer he got from a number of other leadership figures in Congress who are supposed to be overseeing these agencies.
It's truly stunning, and especially because I mean I don't think these people, these sort of like centrist types, recognize, or sort of like right-wing Democrats recognize that when Trump says Antifa, it's so vague. He means them, and he's saying it. He's literally him and Stephen Miller are calling the Democratic Party an extremist organization. So like they're not just coming after us; they're coming after everybody who is like to the left of MAGA. But to your point about, you know, the Patriot Act, or I guess to Rokana's point about the Patriot Act, I'm curious if you could maybe talk a little about the origins of NSPM-7, because I don't want to say it's not unprecedented, or it's unprecedented. It is unprecedented, I guess is what I'm trying to say, obviously, because it's so expansive, but it does build on that post 9/11 counterterrorism. And it really does reflect this kind of bipartisan security state that was built by both parties. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about how that helped build towards this, and maybe perhaps looking ahead, where do you see all of this going?
Yeah, so if you read the directive, it basically authorizes what are called Joint Terrorism Task Forces, most of which were established after and in response to 9/11, which are many FBI agents, but also local law enforcement get deputized into these JTTFs. They exist in every state across the country. There's at least 4,000 of them as far as we know based on the FBI's disclosures. And it allows these JTTFs, as they're called, law enforcement, to go after those indicators that we were just describing and make counterterrorism cases. And so when you adopt a counterterrorism lens, again, Americans are not so familiar with this because so much of it has been pointed overseas, or to the extent that it's here against Muslims. What you're doing is you're trying to preempt an attack, because the theory behind that is that there's some threat so dangerous that we are essentially going to suspend the rules around how you can open cases and premise cases on evidence of a crime having been committed. They know under counterterrorism, there doesn't need to be a crime that was committed. You can get into what I call pre-crime, which is that you are trying to predict a crime. How do you predict a crime? You look at speech. And that's exactly what this authorizes them to do. And it uses the architecture established mostly after 9/11 in the form of these JTTFs to go and carry this out. And what's really alarming about that is amid all the reporting about the National Guard deployments, when I've written on these and interviewed people that have been deployed to them. And what I quickly realized was I thought in large part that fell under the sort of Trump hysterics category, not because it's not alarming and it is, corrosive to democratic culture to have them just in principle, but they are restricted by posse comitatus, and that's why you keep seeing all these videos of them just wandering around picking up trash, just like trying to keep themselves busy, because they don't actually have authority to do anything. But when it comes to the JTTFs, they do have the authority to do this, and they answer directly to the federal government. And so in an almost ingenious way, Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and the White House have found a way to get around the state legislatures and governments who keep blocking them when they try to do what they do with the National Guard. They found a mechanism to be able to pursue whatever it is they want to pursue without them acting as a deterrent. And so that's what's special about NSPM-7 is it uses this architecture to get around state and local authorities.
Mm-hmm. Well, we really appreciate you joining the show. You're doing fantastic work covering this all. Hopefully everyone is following you very closely. Ken Klippenstein, thank you so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me, guys.